Reggie Jean, Boston University Upward Bound manager, project manager, and past president of the New England Education Opportunity Association. Glad that you have such a good crowd here. I want to first talk a little bit about my program to give you sort of the context of what we're about to hear and see. So Upward Bound, for those who don't know, at Boston University, we work with students in the Boston Public Schools. We work with about 75 students from Brighton High School, Cash, English High School, and Snowden. What we do with the students throughout the year is more or less prepare them for college. That's the main mission of the program, to help students who are the low-income, first generation go to and be successful in college. So we're not the only program that does that. Upward Bound is a national program, and we're going to learn a little bit about that today. Patty Gregson, who's the president for NEOA, couldn't be here today. She's on a family reunion in San Diego, so I'm sure she wishes she could be here, but she sends her regards. The New England Education Opportunity Association and the Massachusetts Education Opportunity Association are the sponsors for this event. We're here to learn about Stan Salett, his experiences in the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, and enacting programs designed to assist less fortunate students with overcoming poverty. We are also here to recognize and celebrate his legacy. In Massachusetts, there are about 20 other Upward Bound programs in addition to Boston University. Many of the project managers and directors are here today. Good to see familiar faces. And throughout the country, there are about 90 programs. Through Mr. Salett's work, millions of Americans have been able to participate in programs like Head Start and Upward Bound, and countless other programs. Upward Bound alumni include journalist John Quinones, actress Viola Davis, Angela Bassett, Democratic strategist Donna Brazil, CNN contributor Steve Perry, and astronaut Franklin Chang Diaz. And we are lucky enough to have a couple of alumni here, and we've asked one alumni to come say a few words about her experience in the program at Salem State, and also she had experiences at an Upward Bound program in Maine that she'll share with us. Kahinde Ashodi is, well, I'll let her talk about herself. So please welcome her up on the stage.
Well, good evening, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Kahinde Ashodi, and I was so excited and fortunate that my Upward Bound director, Wendy Porter, she told me about the program, about this event tonight. She emailed me and said, oh, you have to come. So I was like, oh, sure, definitely. And I was also excited to speak because I truly benefited from the Upward Bound program. There's one correction I want to make, though. On your slide, you said that students have interaction, like let's say 7 months of the year. It's a yearly interaction process. I started the program in 1996 when I was entering, finishing 8th grade, going into high school. I heard about the program through a family friend whose own daughter was interested into the program. I have an identical twin sister, so my twin sister and I, we went into the program, and it was really beneficial because we lived with my mother and a younger brother, and my mother was by herself, single mom, and she had 3 jobs, so she wasn't always around after school to help us with our homework or be there for us, or guide us and stay on the right track for school. Upward Bound was that program that was like a second family, is a second family for us. Upward Bound helped us throughout the school programs with tutoring, getting to different activities, workshops. Another benefit of Upward Bound was that as we got older, when we became juniors and seniors, not only the freshman and sophomore year, they helped us with SAT prep, studying for those. One of the things that happened though is that as we got older, junior and senior, my mother wasn't able to take my sister and I to different colleges to visit. We were doing very well academically in school, thanks to Upward Bound the tutors. So Upward Bound, they do college visits not only within the New England area, but they try to expand a little bit more. So that was very beneficial for us too. And also, as my sister and I started looking to colleges, Upward Bound was there to help us through the whole application process, what we should be doing, our timelines. They were there for us. They especially help us too with the financial aid process. like what to expect, like what were the different awards packages all about. A couple of other great things about Upward Bound that I got to experience was going on leadership conferences. And my background, I was interested in the math and science. Both my sister and I were interested in math and science. So Wendy, she knew about the Upward Bound Math and Science program in Maine. So my twin sister, myself, and another student, Eduardo Vargas, the three of us for the last 3 summers, instead of like staying with Upward Bound and going to Salett State University, we got to go to the University of Maine Orono and do the Upward Bound Math and Science program. So we had opportunity like to, because Eduardo and myself, we went into engineering, and my sister went more into the medical field. So just having the opportunity and being with Upward Bound got us that connection to like really explore and expand ourselves. I was fortunate to get into Northeast University, down the street, up the street. So I went to Northeast University and I did my undergraduate civil engineering. And beyond that, I went for my master's at UT Austin for environmental and water resource engineering. And not only once I graduated, like Upward Bound was definitely helpful in getting me to like go towards college, that's their goal. But they were also helpful and they kept maintaining contact with us, like how are we doing in school, how's everything going. And we had opportunities to come back and talk to the current Upward Bound students about like how it really was out there in college and everything. So it was like beneficial. Right now, I came back, I did engineering for 3 years in consulting firm. But right now, just like Upward Bound has given so much to me and like focused so much on education and bettering myself, because I didn't start from the best of backgrounds, but I'm moving up. I went back into, I'm going back right now for teaching. So right now I'm currently a Boston teacher resident with the UMass Boston School affiliated to do my initial license in high school math at UCLA, Boston Community Leadership Academy. So I'm just really excited to be here. I hope you guys all benefit. I'm really excited to meet Mr. Salett because I truly benefit and I am still benefiting from the Upward Bound program. So I really hope you guys continue to support and just hear the wonderful things that Upward Bound has done, not only for me, but I'm sure you hear many other stories too.
So Kende mentioned Wendy. So Wendy Porter Cost, so everyone knows, is director of Salem State Upward Bound program, and she's here. So you're like, who's Wendy? She's in the front row. So it's my pleasure at this moment to introduce Stan Salett. And just to give you a background of Stan and how we came to today, I first met Stan in Washington, D.C. Through the suggestion of Dr. Arnold Mitchell. So Dr. Arnold Mitchell, he's the president of the Council for Opportunity Education, which is the sort of umbrella organization that supports programs like Upward Bound and TRIO. And for those of you who know Dr. Mitchell, when Dr. Mitchell tells you you have to meet somebody, you listen. So I ended up speaking to Stan Salett and another alumni named Rich Nemick, who you'll see in the video later, until very late at night, and just having some great conversations with him. And in fact, I had to go to sleep well before he did. I couldn't keep up. And then I followed up with Stan throughout the years when I've had an opportunity to. We were trying to get him to come to Massachusetts and New England for annual conferences, and it didn't work out. He's not often in this area, but he lives in Washington D.C., outside of Washington D.C. So last week, when we saw Stan in D.C. for a conference, he came to me and said, "Reggie, I'm going to be in D.C." Okay, and I had been stalking Stan for a while, so I was like, "No, that's okay. If it's not going to work out, that's fine." He's like, "No, I'm really going to be there next week, and can we get something together?" And I said, "Sure." Sarah Morrill, had some ideas about what we could do, and so we basically put this program together in 7 days. So we're very fortunate. A lot of people helped out to be able to do that. Stan's fingerprints are in a lot of different programs. The biggest programs are Head Start and Upward Bound. Mr. Salett has a new book that's just released called The Edge of Politics, Stories from the Civil Rights Movement, the War on Poverty, and Challenges of School Reform. He has been able to do what so many people try and fail to do, and that's create lasting change from within the system. His legacy is evidence of what government is capable of. So without further ado, Mr. Stan Salett.
Thank you, I'm sometimes known as being soft-spoken, so this may be helpful. First of all, let me thank, is that all right? First of all, thanks to Reggie and all of you who put this together in such short notice. And it's good to be back in Boston. What you may not know is I grew up here. I was born in Roxbury, grew up in Dorchester. Went to high school here, Boston Latin School. Taught at Boston Latin School rather briefly. Went to Harvard Graduate School of Education, and then to Columbia Graduate School. And like so many others in my generation, drifted down, called down to Washington during the New Frontier days of President Kennedy. And I was very fortunate, within a few months of arriving in Washington, to become part of President Kennedy's staff, something called the President's Committee on Youth Employment. And I can't still explain why it was. Maybe because some of you, or most of you, understand this. There's a certain vernacular called Boston language, and you don't really allow the person you're talking to finish a sentence, where you interrupt in the middle to get in your sentence. Something that's not practiced all over the country, but somehow I could speak Boston, and maybe that has something to do with it. But my first job was on this President's Committee on Youth Employment, and it was, in a sense, a strange job because the main purpose was to support two pieces of legislation that had not passed the Congress, both sponsored by Senator Hubert Humphrey. One was called the Youth Conservation Corps, and the second called the Neighborhood Youth Corps. And it was very clear that these programs, this legislation, weren't going anywhere. For those of you who read about this period, and it's not often talked about, President Kennedy did not have a lot of sway over a democratically controlled Congress. The Democrats who controlled the Congress were conservative Southern Democrats, and they looked upon him as a Northern liberal. He may have been liberal, maybe he's more liberal in center, but anyway, in the South he was considered liberal. He was Catholic, they were not, and they weren't too excited about passing anything that he put forth. And so this particular program, or part of the President's office, didn't do very much. My major task was to look at some of the research on the formerly Civilian Conservation Corps and how those education programs came about. That was interesting to me as a researcher, but I was much more interested in action. And in order to explain that, I have to tell you a little bit about why I was so interested in action and bring you back to Boston. Growing up in Boston, I was very concerned and through personal experience, very involved in the issues of race. Very early on, I joined the Congress of Racial Equality and eventually became like a field organizer for CORE. And when I went into graduate school at Columbia, I was also assigned the task of organizing a CORE chapter at Columbia University. And these were in the early days. It was during or just after the Freedom Rides, and the CORE was expanding very, very rapidly. And so every Wednesday night, from my small apartment off the Columbia University campus, I would go down to 125th Street and go up to a second floor room to the meetings of what was New York City CORE. And they were very exciting meetings for someone which had just been in graduate school, I was exposed to incredible leadership within that group. And some interesting experiences, some of which are in this book. But as these meetings would break out on Wednesday nights, we would all pass by the door and go down the steps to 125th Street. And at the edge of that exit was a tall guy with sort of reddish-brown hair, a wide smile, and a quick patter. And he never talked to me, he'd only smile. But to the African Americans in the group, he'd say, "Why are you going with those folks?" And during that time, there was, and a lot of it was on 125th Street and in the air, these things that you read about were just alive at the time. And I think what I wanted to tell you most of all, and I'll come back to it later, is that what became Upward Bound, Head Start, and the War on Poverty would not have happened without the Civil Rights Movement. That everything that you are, will be, and have been would not have happened without them. And it's something that you've got to understand and learn over and over again. So part of my personal story was that at Columbia, in organizing the Congress of Racial Equality chapter, I did a project that was done at 3 other universities, at Columbia, Syracuse, and the University of Chicago, again described in the book a bit. And we were concerned because Columbia University was discriminating in its off-campus housing. I would never admit to it. So if you went in and asked for housing, and you were white, or you were black, or you were Asian, that would be noted on the simple system of 3x5 cars. And then if you called in and said, "I have an apartment to rent," or "I have a room to rent in an apartment," and you had some restrictions on that, that would also be noted. And so the university, in effect, was steering people depending on racial and ethnic attitudes and discrimination and choices of the people who were renting rooms in apartments. But Columbia wouldn't admit it. And so in those days we did a lot of testing, and we tested with couples and individuals coming in, and the people calling and offering to rent rooms. We kept records of all this and so on. But to do that is not enough. What you have to do is you have to bring it out. You have to publicize it. So how do we publicize it? Well, James Farmer, who was the head of CORE, and came to New York, and he made a major speech. And he said, while all this was going on in the South, don't think that racism is only in the South. It's here in the North. In fact, it's practiced by some of our finest institutions. In fact, by some of our universities. And since this was in New York, when they asked him what universities, and he mentioned Columbia, the press went crazy. And they said, well, what's your evidence? How do you know this? And so on. And so he told the press, just call Stan Salett. But I didn't answer those calls. I referred them. And where did I refer them to? I referred them to the Columbia Student Newspaper. I gave them the exclusive rights to that information. So think of yourself working at a student newspaper in New York, and you're called by the New York Times. But the story is not one story. The story is a series of stories that's led out over time. So what happens? Well, my major objective was to build this Congress of Racial Equality chapter at Columbia. We started maybe with 5, 7 people, and the story came out in the Columbia Spectator. More people came, more people came, more people came. And it sort of mirrored the growth of the movement itself. Well, I finished my work at Columbia, came down to Washington, as I said, joined the President's Committee on Youth Employment. But I didn't stop my civil rights activity. I became co-chair of Washington CORE. And so on the weekends, and sometimes during the evenings, I was out in the demonstrations that you all read about, getting arrested, getting names and pictures in the paper, and then then Monday morning I would show up, and by now I had moved to the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, headed by Robert Kennedy. So there was this split, you know, what was I doing, and what did it mean, and so on. So I had to pass on the word that if I was embarrassing to them, I would quit my government job, my President's Committee job, because that's really what I wanted to do. And so it went to Bobby Kennedy, and he passed on the word that it was fine with him. Just don't get arrested for anything else, but you can get arrested for civil rights. But what I found out and what I learned, again, this is part of the important piece of history, is that the Kennedy brothers, while sympathetic to civil rights, were not about to move heavily in that direction. And I remember a meeting, which is also in the book, about a meeting with Ted Sorensen in the White House, and a small group of us. And he was talking about the Kennedy administration and what they were doing in various areas. And I asked him, as I had to do, I said, what about the civil rights legislation? When are you going to do civil rights legislation? And he responded and he said, does the figure 100,000 mean anything to you? And I knew exactly what he meant. And I don't know how many of you know what that would mean? The 1960 election that elected President Kennedy was decided by fewer than a little more than 100,000 votes. And so their attitude and their position was that civil rights would come in the next administration, in the next term. That was that message. Now, of course, that administration moved a lot, and it moved a lot because of the movement outside. And again, that becomes important to keep in mind. There was a broad social movement in the country, and asking for, now the word has changed, but they were asking for specific changes, not just in civil rights legislation defined very narrowly in terms of the bus stations along the trailways and the Greyhound routes where the Freedom Riders went, not just with that. But remember, the March on Washington was also a story there. The March on Washington was for jobs and freedom. That's what it was called. Jobs and freedom. So even then, it became an economic interest. Right out, right straight. So then what happens with the rest of my part of the personal story? So then this is before President Kennedy's assassination. There's a task force on the war on poverty, task force on poverty, to draft legislation of some kind and to bring some of the things that we had learned at the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency to the task force on poverty. And my job for Bobby Kennedy was to work on the education components of these broad community action, which later become community action agencies, like something that in that time was called ABCD in Boston. And so I worked with ABCD. But he wanted me to go and bring that perspective to the task force on poverty. I work on some of the draft of the legislation. The legislation passes, and I'm very fortunate to be named Director of Education within the Community Action Program. And then, of course, what do? Well, if you read about the Office of Economic Opportunity in the legislation, it mentions a lot of things, but it doesn't define very much. Community action is supposed to be coming up from the ground. There's no mention of Upward Bound or Head Start and so on. And so it fell to us on the staff to begin to further define this. And this had never happened before. There was no necessary enabling legislation. We had the legislation. We were part of the executive office of the president. We were not a cabinet agency. And while we're doing all this, the civil rights movement is continuing. There are still people in the streets, there are still people demonstrating, and so on. And by now Lyndon Johnson is president. And Johnson does something very, very important. Again, largely unwritten about. He gains office and he calls James Farmer, he calls Martin Luther King Jr., he calls Roger Wilkins, and he calls Whitney Young, the head of the Urban League. And I meet with Farmer just after this, just so you know where the story comes from. And Farmer tells me about the meeting, and he's amazed. I said, "What happened?" And he said, President Johnson said he did not know what to do. He said, "Tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. I want to address these issues. I don't know what to do." Johnson had the ability to bring things out. He could bring things through the same democratically controlled Southern Democrat Congress, but he didn't know what to do. And so the ideas came. And one of the ideas was community action. Johnson was not sure about community. He didn't really understand it. He was much more out of the New Deal. He had worked in the New Deal. He had been head of the National Youth Administration in Texas as a young man. He could understand the Job Corps because that was like Civilian Conservation Corps. He could understand some of the other programs, even Vista volunteers in the community. But community action, where people get organized at a neighborhood level and begin to come to mayors and office holders with programs or demands about and their ideas about what should be done. He didn't know whether he liked that, but he allowed that to go forward. So we have the program, and we have Job Corps and Vista and something vaguely called community action. And the beginnings of that were not very, let's say, sound. There were problems in some of the first Job Corps centers. Johnson wanted the first Job Corps center to be in Texas, San Marcos, Texas, so it was there. There were some problems in that place. The second Job Corps center was in Washington, D.C., and he took a direct hand in it. I'll tell you another side story. Johnson wanted a photo opportunity of the first Job Corps enrollees in Washington. So they come to the White House, and the photographer sets up these rows of Job Corps kids on stands and so on, right? Levels, you've seen those kinds of pictures, right? Photographers all said, Johnson comes into the room. He said, no. You're going to put this person over there and this person over here and so on. He rearranged the entire room. And what most people don't know is that's what he used to do in Texas. He knew all about that. Johnson was incredible because he was a hands-on person. And this, again, relates to part of my story. Because then, of course, what to do with community action. We had to have programs that people could identify that came out of, through, or by community action. And so one day I get a call from Sergeant Shriver, who's head of. He calls me up and he says, Stan, I understand that we're doing a lot of early childhood demonstrations. We have been doing that research and demonstration programs that actually had come over from the Office of Education. And he said, we had one in New York, one in Chicago, and so on around the country. He said, I'd like you to call those folks together, and bring them to Washington, and see if they would support a major summer demonstration of early childhood development. And I said, fine. I said, how much of a demonstration? And he said, well, let's say about $25 million, which is a fairly major sum. So I call up these researchers, and of course they all agree to come. We're giving them the grants. And then a colleague of mine, Bill Ryu from the Office of Education, says, you just can't do it with these early childhood people. You've got to invite the head of the Nursery School Association, somebody from the Merrill Palmer Institute, people who aren't directly related to that, the universities involved, and so on. So, okay. So I invite them. 3 days before the meeting, I get a call from Sergeant Shriver. And he says, I just got a call from President Johnson, and he wants you to invite a philosophy professor from the University of Texas to the meeting. And I said, what does a philosophy professor know about early childhood development? He said, well, I asked the president the same thing. And the president said, well, his name is John Silver, and he knows everything about it. I think that name, and so I called John Silver, and he comes, and he participates. So the meeting goes on. But before I talk about the meeting, again, think about a president of the United States knowing about a meeting that's being held several floors down in the hierarchy and knowing when it is and interceding to have somebody invited to it. Think of that breadth of knowledge and detail. So we have the meeting, and everybody talks about their research, and there's back and forth and so on, and the meeting drags on and drags on. It's lunchtime. I had sandwiches brought in. I didn't want to lose anybody. I bought everybody's tickets, so I knew that the first people had to leave about 2 o'clock. We weren't really reaching any consensus. So I said something which was kind of risky for somebody in his mid-20s to talk to all the senior people. And I said, look, I'm going to do something very unorthodox. I'm going to put the question up that the Office of Economic Opportunity will sponsor an early childhood development demonstration program this next summer, and we'll spend $25 million on it based on your research, your knowledge, and your experience. Would you say up or down? Vote. So they vote. The meeting disperses. I call Sergeant Shriver on the line, describe the meeting, tell him that we took a vote. He said, well, what was the vote? And I said, I don't think you're going to like it very much. It was about 50-50 in the room. And he said, that's okay, I think we'll go ahead. And that was one of the ways that Head Start got started. Not the only way, because Shriver was non-hierarchical, and he tended to give duplicate tasks to different people who would gather a lot of kind of information. But this was definitely part of the thing. Okay, so where does Upward Bound come from? The Office of Economic Opportunity is continuing. Head Start is starting up. And there's continuing pressure from President Johnson and from him through Sergeant Shriver to create what we called new national emphasis programs. In other programs that you could touch, feel, understand, that would be part of community action, related in some way to it, from it, by it, in concert with it, but we could associate somehow with it. It would be for low-income people, low-income students, and so on, but that people could understand what was going on. And so within a 6 or 8 month period, demonstrations are still going on. The country has not settled all the civil rights stuff and so on, concern about jobs and about poverty and so on. Within a 6 month period, I'm working in one office on Head Start and then Upward Bound. Next office, somebody is working on community health centers. The first one out in Columbia Point before the JFK Library was there. Somebody else is working on neighborhood legal services. Edgar Kahn and his wife Jean Kahn had written a key article in the Yale Law Review proposing that. Shriver called them up and they came in to work on the actual creation of a program. The foster grandparents program is going on in another room, and so on. All this is happening at the same time. I mean, can you imagine that? Unbelievable. And there was no enabling legislation. Nobody had to go to Congress to ask permission. We were all trying to respond to the turmoil in the country. And that's how Upward Bound came about. And specifically, I'll tell you the story of that. We had community action agencies like ABCD all over the country. Colleges were beginning to come to them and say, look, we want to do something too. You know, is there some way that we can relate to low-income students? Some of the foundations had been around, so it wasn't a strange idea. And I was getting these calls would it fit within our guidelines? You know, you helped to draft the legislation, and part of the message, this is an inside baseball kind of story, if it fit within the guidelines, did it have to come out of the allocation to the Community Action Agency, or was it a demonstration program? If it was, they could still get it done, but out of a separate pile of money. Right? And those of you who are involved in Upper Valley in the detail know about different piles of money and guidelines and so on. And so I began to get these ideas and these proposals. And I had this opportunity because I'd been part of the development of Head Start and saw these other things. I said, aha, here's a potential national demonstration program. So I began to put them together, some of the first programs, I think there were about 17 of them, and wrote a memorandum that went up the line to Sergeant Shriver proposing a national demonstration of pre-college programs. Upward Bound hadn't been a name yet. And so Shriver invited me out to his house to meet on it and explain it and so on. And again, you could be far down and so on, but hierarchy didn't matter. So picture this: I'm on the back porch of Shriver's house or farm estate, large lawn in the back, and we're sitting on the back, and he had read the memo, and we're talking about it. And then out on the field is a tractor trailer pulling a big cart. And driving the tractor trailer is Sarge's oldest son, who could have been more than 12 years old. And Maria and her other brothers are hanging out the side, hanging out, you know, he's driving around, I'm looking like this. And Sarge, it's like it happens all the time. It's part of the deal and so on, and it's just an amazing conversation. But distracted as I was, I explained it, and he said, okay, what I want you to do is make a presentation to the senior staff. And so he circulated the memo, I made the presentation to the senior staff. So I went around and said, what do you think of this? This is a national emphasis program, pre-college. Here are the first 17. Here's what they look like. There are wide varieties. Some are going to work with high school students at the sophomore level, some are junior, some are going to be heavily in the summer, some not so much, some more during the school year, some have a specific role for graduate students, some have this interest in the curriculum, some not, and so on. But I think we have something here. And so they supported it and allocated a fairly large sum of money for the first summer demonstration, pre-college programs, and became known as Head Start.
No.
And Upward Bound. Upward Bound. Get the national emphasis programs mixed up. So let me stop there, and I apologize for being longish and so on. I try to give you the context of